a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, writers. This is Grant Faulkner, and I want to tell you about my book editing and coaching services. You know, if there's one thing I like as much as writing, or maybe even more than writing, it's helping others with their writing. And I've been working with writers for more than 30 years as a writer, teacher, editor, and publisher. And then I've been executive director of National Novel Writing Month, and I've written 3 books and many essays about writing. And I've talked to more than 300 authors on Right Minded. So I think I've got a thing or two to offer. If you go to my website, which is grantfaulkner.com, and click the coaching and editing tab, there's a lot of info there about my services. But the basics are that I do one-on-one coaching, manuscript assessments and editing, and book proposal assistance. I've worked with writers on everything from flash fiction to novels to memoirs to personal essays and even op-eds. So if you're interested, here's how it works. I do a brief Zoom chat with you to get an idea of your needs, and then we set up a plan, and then we go from there. So just email me at wgfaulkner@gmail.com. That's wgfaulkner@gmail.com, and we can take it from there. There's also a contact form on my website if you forget that email address. So happy writing, everybody, and I hope to hear from you. Hello, poets and novelists, especially those rare writers who make novels out of your poems and poems out of your novels. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm here with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, I'm excited today because our guest today, Forrest Gander, is not only the 3rd Pulitzer Prize award-winning author we've had on the show, but he's written this really thought-provoking, beautiful, kind of perambulating poem that he calls a novel poem. And since I'm one who likes to see the narrative forms morph and take different shapes, I'm super excited about his book, Mojave Ghost. And I know you've been very interested in the ways our conventional literary forms are taking on new shapes. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I definitely have been. And it's actually been a little bit of an obsession of mine for the past couple of years. Mm-hmm. You know, we're just seeing so much creativity, maybe especially in the memoir space, obviously, which is the space I'm watching most closely. But I've been tuning in so much to writers who are breaking form, playing with form, dancing with their structure and presentation, and doing all manner of hybrid work and mosaic writing. Just to name a few authors we've had on the show very recently who've been doing this kind of expansive thinking in their work, Carvel Wallace, Liz Rosner, and most recently Faith Adiele. And guests from earlier in the year come to mind too. Maggie Smith with her book, You Can Make This Place Beautiful, and Shi Hui Chua, who wrote The Story Game. And I feel like the entire approach to, what we can do within the memoir genre, and I'm sure this is true of other genres equally, but it's really been turned on its head in recent years, and I think in the very best and most freeing ways.
Yeah, I had an interesting reading experience with Mojave Ghost because I hadn't heard it defined as a novel poem before reading it, and that's what Forrest calls it. Actually, he came up with that term, but I didn't know anything about it except what I'd learned from his preface, that the book was born out of his grief and his walks along the San Andreas Fault and his return to the place he grew up in, which is Barstow, California. And so I was actually a little confused by it at first while I was reading it because it was different than other poetry collection. Like none of the poems had titles, but they were just kind of often separated by an asterisk. So they were all connected, really. They weren't separate poems. And reading the book was kind of drifty and meandering, and he strings an indistinct narrative through poems and invites the reader, in to fill the gaps. But, most novels, conventional novels, certainly usually avoid narrative gaps. But this one goes in and out of scenes and memories, and you're constantly grappling with the gaps, which is, to be honest, perhaps my favorite type of reading experience these days. So I really loved it. But it was interesting to read an interview with Forrest afterwards and hear him talk about the way he kind of feels himself as a collage or kaleidoscopic, which is an interesting metaphor to view the self through.
Yeah, and I like that so much because collage and kaleidoscope are both good visuals that evoke this way of piecing stories together, I think. For me, that brought up fragments, whether you're collaging or it's a kaleidoscope, you're bringing multiple parts to create a beautiful whole. And Forrest said something very interesting in an interview that I read, basically drawing parallels between his poetic approach to the techniques of Cubist artists. And in that interview, he mentioned that his poetry often involves, quote, a kind of Cubist approach to the subject, where he examines a subject from multiple perspectives to create a multifaceted representation. I just think that's a great visual metaphor for writers, because that is what we're doing. We're tracking our memories and experiences and then presenting them on the page from various angles simultaneously, just like Cubist art. And in his book, Forrest also references a body of South Indian literature called Sangam, and its poems, which are called Akam. And in that tradition, it was considered not only unethical, but impossible to write about the self without taking into account the landscape. I love that. And scholars say that the ultimate goal of that type of poetry is the dissolution of any split between self and world. I think we see the impact that had on him in this book, Mojave Ghost, which shows us a series of walks that he took along the San Andreas Fault, and his self-exploration mingles with geography and history, natural history and geology. So it is a profoundly felt and deep thinking book at the same time. And I do think he does a beautiful job accessing both heart and head at the same time, which is kind of a hard balance to strike sometimes.
Definitely is. And I think part of that is about so many, boundaries breaking down in his work. It's an elegiac and melancholic work because he's grieving the recent loss of his wife, the poet C.D. Wright, and his mother and his sister. And I think he's grieving a sense of himself as well in the book. So the ghost in the title is very present in the mood of this poem because he's addressing memories and he's reckoning with memories, and that reckoning isn't always fulfilling. A pervasive theme of this book is the narrator's inability to embrace the full history of others, whether the ghost of his past or the kind of slightly hallucinatory but living friend before him. And Brooke, I was thinking about this because we've dealt with so many authors on the show who are dealing with grief, in a number of our episodes on Right Minded. And, perhaps that's because, as Sigrid Nunez once said, most of writing is about loss of some kind. So I was thinking we could put out a book with all of the different responses to loss or grief.
So many of the memoirists I work with are working on things adjacent or directly related to loss. And what Nunez says is especially true because loss isn't just about losing someone to death. Loss can be about losing someone you love in a divorce or estrangement, to drugs or mental health crises. And then you can also lose things. You lose homes to fires or floods, or precious objects can be lost from theft or misplacement or just plain losing things. And we as humans, we orient ourselves in relation to the people we love and our community and the things that we own. It's all wrapped up in belonging and security. And so, of course, these subjects are, probably in literally every piece of great writing in some capacity, whether big or small.
Yeah, I often think about what Edwidge Danticat wrote about when she wrote about grief, and that it's not linear or chronological. It spirals through life. And then Roland Barthes wrote about how grief can interrupt the most mundane moments. It's ever present. And I think you feel those feelings and the many textures of grief in Mojave Ghost. So I have to say that I'm so happy he wrote this as a novel poem and not a traditional collection of poems. These poems needed to be strung together and not ordered with titles. He captures that sense of spiraling and the interruptive nature of grief as a result. So I can't wait to hear more from Forrest after this short break. Welcome back, everybody. I'm excited to introduce Forrest Gander to the podcast. And Forrest was born in the Mojave Desert in Barstow, California, and he grew up in Virginia. He spent significant years in San Francisco, Dolores Hidalgo, Mexico, Eureka Springs, and Providence. Forrest's book, Be With, was awarded the 2019 Pulitzer Prize, and his book, Core Samples from the World, was a finalist for the Pulitzer and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Forrest holds degrees in both geology and English literature. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And he now lives in Northern California with his wife, the artist Ashwini Bhatt. Welcome, Forrest.
Thank you.
Forrest, I'm very curious about your description of Mojave Ghost, your newest collection of poetry as a novel poem. So it's not really a collection of poetry, and the novel poem, it's not a form that I'd really heard of before. We've had on authors like Elizabeth Acevedo and Kwame Alexander, both of whom wrote novels in verse, but their works seem more tilted towards like a traditional novel with a plot supporting the verse. And your novel poem is more unplotted, yet it's a journey. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how and why you conceived of this as a novel poem.
Well, I like the term novel in both its senses. For me, this is a completely different kind of poem than I've written before. I wanted to write more intimately, directly, without the kind of acrobatic syntax that has interested me in all of my previous work. And this is more plaintive. And it takes place in sentences more than in dramatic, line-broken, poetic lines. And then it has as you mentioned, a kind of geographical narrative. It begins in Arkansas, moves to California, and then it travels down the San Andreas Fault to the place where I was born in the Mojave Desert. So because of that narrative trajectory and geographical trajectory, and because it's a novel in the sense of being really a new form for me, I did make up that term, novel poem.
Well, I loved it. And I loved the whole, I guess, the mood, the kind of walking mood to it, and the walking thoughtfulness of it. And I was wondering if you could read a portion of it so that listeners can get a taste.
Sure. So as you know, there are no titles. It's really just one poem all the way through, divided into little sections. The changing dune line opens contours of meanings other than the ones for which we're prepared. But how to sustain attentiveness, how to keep the mind from dropping its needle into the worn grooves of association. My art, you said in passing, is nothing much more than the discipline of an embodied life. Articulating nuance, the delicate palette. At home in your studio, you paint details with a tiny brush you made yourself of hair plucked from your forearm. They distrust me, you said, because they can tell I prefer my work to their own. Which is when I tucked a red anemone under your pillow to bring you good dreams. What else did you say? Fair enough. It is a marriage of equals and without degree. Your trace on me, like rope marks on the well's mouth. Here, have a thought. As for our misfit status, as Brecht observed, the palace of canonical culture is built on not to interpret, to feel life course through you.
Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Forrest. I want to ask you about grief. The work is inspired in large part by grief and the losses of your late wife, the poet C.D. Wright, your mother, and your sister. And trying to find a way forward amid so much grief, you began to hike the 800-mile San Andreas Fault. Wordsworth was said to walk his way into his poems. And Grant was asking you about the walking and the journey, and what role did walking play in your creative process?
It's funny you bring up Wordsworth, Brooke. He famously walked composing his poems back and forth in his room, whereas his friend Coleridge walked those fantastic hills around the lake country. And for me, the walking was a form of meditation. You know, it was sort of like a secular version of walking the Stations of the Cross, and getting away from the tree line or a busy landscape in the vulnerable landscape of the desert. It humbled me. I felt so ungrounded in these losses that I'd experienced. And the walking, which, as Grant says, I hope you can feel in the movement of the poems, became a way of locating myself again. And at the same time, I became very aware, walking along the San Andreas Fault, how geologically there was a tectonic plate on the right of me that was subducting, and a tectonic plate on the left of me that was overriding it. And that became a kind of metaphor for the way that I felt my grief on one side of me. And on my other, I was with this person in a new relationship, and she was full of life. And so I felt the landscape mirroring my own psyche.
I love that, Forrest, and especially, because the landscape does play so large in the poem. And it's interesting because you have a degree in geology. And as you say in your preface, geology is a profession of disinterring memories. And you also say that geologists know how history lies not far beneath the surface. So I'm curious how your education in geology influenced these poems.
Geology changed my way of looking at things because it taught me that to understand something, you have to be able to see the large scale structures. You look at a mountain from a distance and you can see how it was uplifted and you can see fault lines through it. But to really know what happened and what's there, you also have to look at the crystalline structures in the shear zones. You have to look at microscopic things. And look at sonic testing to find density patterns. So that jogging back and forth between the large scale and the small scale, between conception and particularity, has sort of guided me as a writer.
I want to take us back to this disconnection that you felt in your grief. And you start Mojave Ghost with a poignant phrase on the first page. There is nothing in me now of what I was before. And you said that you felt yourself as an unstable collage and that you felt your sense of self becoming kaleidoscopic on these walks. And so I'm curious about that sense of self. I mean, I'm curious about it from a writing perspective, but also curious from like an integrative perspective. If you come back to certain aspects of who you were before, as you walk through the grief and as you, like I said, integrate all the things. And so I wondered if you could speak about, that experience, but also this question of something being kaleidoscopic and how you show that in writing, which I guess sort of necessitates a fragmented style.
Actually, that question connects to the one that Grant asked, that in geology, what's coming to the surface is what's been deep underneath the surface. And also the surface is wearing down and becoming and disappearing. And in a similar way, in the wake of these griefs, I was very aware of how much my past was surfacing and how real it was in my present. It could be more real than something that I was experiencing in the actual so-called present. And so I felt more than ever the way that myself was divided, that my past and my present, that the self that watched myself, that sort of narrates my life to me, and the self that reacts immediately, the past self and the self engaging with this landscape, because our minds are always in relationship to what's around us. All of those gave me the sense of being multiple, of being not schizophrenic, but of recognizing how convenient it is to think of ourselves as a singularity when I think in truth, when we look closely, that we're a multiplicity of selves.
Yeah. What brings up Walt Whitman's "We contain multitudes," right?
Yeah, Walt Whitman says everything.
Yeah. Well, you and the poet C.D. Wright, you're married and you had a house in Rhode Island and you both taught at Brown University. So I'm interested in that, what it means to be so close to another artist, another person working in the same field as you. And one stanza in the poem reads, "There's a sub-level attunement between us. Our interactions dilate, contract, and extend. And the feeling of all that is the measure of how we've lived." And so I was wondering if you can speak more about how creating a life with a fellow poet influenced your work.
And about maybe how important it is to write about the domestic, which hasn't been a realm that a lot of male poets or male writers tend to focus on. But in fact, Rimbaud says domesticity leads too far. But I'm mostly interested in how the intimate trains us, how it models our behavior in the large scale, so that our politics and our grand statements about our philosophical perspective, I think when that's not lived out at the intimate level, that it's just bloviation, and that we have to look at how we relate to the people that we're closest to find out who we are and what our ethics are like. So living with CD was an extraordinary, the privilege of my life. She was a brilliant, ethical, funny, and not once in 35 years of my life with her was she for 1 second uninteresting. She was a fascinating person. So living together, we shared our major passions. We ran a press together. We read each other's work. We talked about poetry and philosophy, and it was a deeply shared life. Now I'm in a relationship that's also deeply shared with someone in a different field who's an artist, and that's also very stimulating. And in a different way, it brings different trajectories together. And so we've done a lot of collaborations already.
Well, you're scooping my next question here, Forrest, because, you and CD will often be mentioned in the same breath, and you're talking about collaboration. I was going to ask you about your love of collaboration, and you've collaborated with some of our favorite artists, such as the photographer Sally Mann and the musician Vic Chestnut. And now, as you mentioned, your wife, Ashwini. So can you tell us more about why you've done so many collaborations and in so many different mediums?
For me, collaboration, it also gets back to the question we were just talking about, because I think it has to do with modeling and ethics, that in a way, collaboration is very much like translation, that you have to upend your ego. You have to listen really deeply to someone else, to the music in someone else's mind, the vision in someone else's art, and that you give up control to work out something else. And I think the surprising benefit of that is that you arrive in places that you wouldn't have ever brought yourself to on your own. And that can be a very creative process. But I like thinking that we're here together, that we're part of one another. And I'm less interested in the old image of the genius who works alone in the attic and produces work. I think Cormac McCarthy says that books are made of books, and our ideas are stronger, I think, when they're shared.
Forrest, I'm going to ask a question that maybe is rooted in the idea of the lone genius, but I'm very curious. I started to think about this while I was preparing for this interview, and since you went back to Barstow as part of the writing of this book, and I grew up in this small town in Iowa that you might call the Barstow of Iowa, and I haven't won a Pulitzer, but sometimes I do wonder, like, how did I go from there to here? And for you to go from Barstow to winning a Pulitzer, I started thinking if you were going to put odds on that at your birth in Vegas, they're pretty low, right? And so how did you go from Barstow to winning a Pulitzer, and how has winning a Pulitzer, has it changed you at all or influenced your poetry or your sense of yourself as a poet in the world?
I think C.D. Wright had genius. And I think that I recognized that I didn't have genius, and what I had instead was diligence, that I had really good focus, and that I had an expansive curiosity. But being around someone who was as bitten to the bone as CD was, was inspiring me to me all of my life. And being around Ashwini Bhatt now, she's a total work dog, and it's her joy, but it's what she's thinking about all the time. And I think Sylvia Plath talks about that also, how all of her friends, her close friends, artist friends, were, eating and breathing the art that they wanted to create and were sharing with each other.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Thanks for that, Forrest.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much. I'm really grateful to get to talk to you and for what you do.
We'll be right back with today's Substackin'.
For this week's Substackin', I want to highlight a series of posts I've been doing and will continue to do, inspired by this show. Edwidge Danticott said that she writes both as a witness and out of a sensibility of love. And she originally came to that stance from James Baldwin. And we've also heard from Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, who said the same thing on this show. And I know I've heard others say it as well. So I've become curious, what does writing with love mean? And I hate to put you on the spot with such a big question, Brooke, but when you hear that question, what do you think it means?
Well, I think I'm going to lean into James Baldwin on this one. He described writing as an act of bearing witness, meaning that a writer, particularly one dealing with sensitive social issues like race and sexuality, has a responsibility to honestly portray the realities of their experience and the world around them, even if it's uncomfortable or challenging for the reader, and with a deep sense of love and empathy for humanity at its core. So that should be kind of a beacon for anyone who's thinking about these big concepts. I mean, Baldwin, of course, could have written with anger or hatred, and boy, would that have been understandable and justified given the injustices that he faced in his lifetime. But he believed that writing should be infused with compassion and this, desire that he fostered, around just understanding different groups of people. And that's where the love comes in. One of my favorite quotes of his is, "The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible." So that is profound. And maybe it's easier to write from a place of outrage or trying to make yourself right. But when you write with love, toward love, you give people more leeway to meet you and join you. And I certainly hope in these years to come, under our new political circumstances, that we, the resistors, can do what we can to make the revolution irresistible.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason I'm pursuing this topic in my Substacks. And I love what you said and love what James Baldwin said. And it makes me think of one of the comments on I think my first post on this. The first post was about Edwidge and her book, We're Alone, which we featured here on Right Minded. And the commenter said, "I wonder if writing from a place of love or with love in a memoir is holding another person's humanity in your words, even if they committed egregious acts." And that might be the definition of writing with love, which is somehow to get beyond your own anger or hurt and try to understand others or try to present them as humans and not monsters. And, some people write for revenge, in other words, and, revenge doesn't tend to make the revolution or a book irresistible, So I know you deal with that a lot in teaching memoir, people who are writing with a very kind of narrow focus on more the vengeful rather than the loving aspects of the story.
Yeah, for sure. It's so true. And it is revenge. Like sometimes, although I think that revenge is baked into grievance, because that's how it comes out when I see this kind of writing, that it's really about wanting to set the record straight or needing to say like, it happened this way and this is my version and believe me, and it's not fair. And that stuff just doesn't read well, and it doesn't bring the writer any sympathy in memoir. The writer does have to take ownership for their role in things in order to be a sympathetic character. But then, of course, there are these stories where you're the victim, right? Other people behave badly. But even in those contexts, vilifying that person as just like 100% evil, it doesn't really really work. Like, to your point, you have to bring the humanity even to someone who behaved monstrously, like an abuser. And that is not easy work. And it's better, like the writing is better because it's complex. You know, if you really allow yourself to get into that, to get more nuanced and to show how anyone is really, in fact, capable of despicable acts. I mean, not everybody is an abuser, but human beings are super complicated. You know, we brought this up in the interview with Forrest that, like, we all contain multitudes, right? And it's not an easy thing to grapple with in life or on the page. And so what you're bringing up is hugely important. And I always try to be kind when I give assessment feedback that people are, you know, kind of leaning into grievance, because oftentimes other readers won't tell you that. So you want to be really mindful about, you know, what your intention is.
Yeah, this makes me think of Carvel Wallace, who was on our show recently, of course, and both his memoir and our talk with him, you know, really added to my thoughts about love and writing with love. And he talked about love in just such a wonderful, nuanced, contradictory, provocative ways. And among other things, he defined love as a struggle, and a personal struggle, but also a struggle with those who you love and who love you, and a struggle to love better, and a struggle to notice and to express and just to be better. And I think grounding love and writing with love and struggle is crucial, because love is far from being a fairy tale story of happiness, you know. And Carvel points out that struggle includes devotion and commitment. And I think that speaks to Baldwin's point as well. You know, as a writer, he serves as a witness, and as a witness to atrocious acts, but in writing with compassion, he enters into a struggle.
I saw in one of your recent Substack posts that you quoted something that Maggie Smith posted on Facebook, and she said, quote, "I said to a friend the other day, love has radicalized me. Love for myself, love for you, whether I know you or not. What else is there of any real worth? What can we build without it?" And what a beautiful concept to keep in mind, you know, for these trying times. And Grant, I know you're not done writing about this subject of love.
There's a long way to go, and I'm energized by the subject, actually. You know, I think it's going to be an ongoing theme and exploration in my newsletter, and a lifetime exploration, I suppose. And I quoted Maggie because her words were exactly what I felt. You know, love can be radicalizing. And how are we going to rebuild this world without it? Because we have to rebuild this world. You know, we have to make the revolution irresistible.
Hear, hear. Well, and it's wonderful to hear how many of the writers on our show get right-minded through love. And, you know, we feel the love of our listeners. We love our listeners. You know, there is a sort of reciprocity in all of this. And we can just keep uplifting our own words and be thinking about these things, you know, about the layers of what we're unpacking, and strive toward love, as Baldwin suggests. We invite you to keep tuning in each week to keep this conversation going. Thank you. We're here every week, and we appreciate you. See you next time.